Welcome to Within the Frame, where we bring the most pressing issues across the globe into focus. I'm Kim Mok-yeon. The United States and Iran may have agreed to a 2-week ceasefire, but uncertainty across the Middle East remains high. The deal was tied to reopening the Strait of Hormuz, one of the world's most critical energy shipping routes. Yet, ships near the waterway are still reportedly largely standing still. At the same time, President Trump says U.S. military forces will remain in the region while negotiations move forward, raising questions about whether this fragile truce can hold. For more on how this development is being viewed over in the United States, we're joined by independent journalist Chris Casquejo. Welcome, Chris.
Good to be with you.
So, Chris, the U.S. and Iran, they agreed to a 2-week ceasefire tied to reopening the Strait of Hormuz, as we all know, but shipping traffic there still appears extremely limited. So from the U.S. perspective, how significant is this latest development?
The ceasefire agreement is significant, but it's also very fragile, as we've seen in the hours since it was agreed to. And this ceasefire deal came down to the final hours. Trump had set that 8 p.m. Tuesday Eastern deadline, threatening to bomb every bridge and power plant in Iran if no agreement was reached. Now, less than 2 hours before that deadline, a ceasefire was announced, and it was personally brokered by Pakistan's Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif, who asked Trump to stand down and asked Iran to reopen the Strait of Hormuz as a goodwill gesture. Now, the White House is calling this ceasefire agreement a clear win, saying Trump and the U.S. military got Iran to agree to reopening the Strait of Hormuz. And on the surface, that's true. But as a practical matter, it really isn't true. Iran halted oil tanker traffic again after Israel struck Lebanon heavily. And according to Lloyd's List, which tracks maritime shipping data, only 3 ships passed through the strait on Wednesday, which means 100 ships remain effectively stalled. Now, before the war started, 100 to 120 ships pass through the strait every single day. Iran has also announced alternative routes for ships, citing the risk of sea mines in the main zone of the waterway, a significant complication that suggests that free passage of the strait remains a challenge. So Washington got the announcement it wanted, but as a practical matter, there's a lot to be resolved.
Right. The situation definitely seems still very fluid. But, you know, the conflict, it has been escalating for weeks before this last-minute truce. How have Americans been reacting during this period of rising tensions leading up to this announcement?
Look, this war has never been popular with the American public, and it's gotten less popular as the weeks have gone on. A Reuters Ipsos poll found that 61% of Americans actively disapprove of the war. That's up 18 points from the earliest days of the conflict. An AP poll found that roughly 6 in 10 Americans say the military action has simply gone too far. Now, where you see really unity among the American public is on the economy. Gas prices have become the great equalizer across party lines here. About 3/4 of Republicans and 2/3 of Democrats say preventing price increases at the pump is highly important to them. An AP NORC poll found that nearly half of Americans are extremely worried about being able to afford gas in the coming months, and that's up sharply from before the war started. And it's showing up in Trump's poll numbers. A Reuters Ipsos poll put his approval rating at 36%, the lowest of his second term, with only 25% approving of his handling of the cost of living. That's a striking number for a president who ran on affordability. On Capitol Hill, House Democrats announced they will try to pass a war powers resolution, but that's not likely to go anywhere with Republicans still in control of Congress. But it signals some of the political pressure that Trump is now facing from his own base and from the opposition party.
Right. So it seems many Americans are also very concerned about rising oil prices and broader economic impacts over there. Then, Chris, tell us, for our viewers, how much of an issue of this conflict has become for the U.S. economy?
Sure, it's been a serious shock to the U.S. economy. When Iran closed the Strait of Hormuz, it effectively cut off about 20% of the world's oil supply, and there's really no easy workaround for that. Now, the AP says the economic fallout has threatened food supplies in developing countries, which has driven up fertilizer prices and putting central banks, including the Federal Reserve here in the U.S., under pressure to tame inflation, which was already, they had wanted to get it to 2.5%, and they had largely succeeded, but the war had opened up that bag. And for everyday Americans, gas has crossed an average of $4 a gallon, the first time since the Russia-Ukraine war started in 2022, and oil was sitting near $110 a barrel in the days before the ceasefire. And this pain has spread well beyond the pump. United Airlines raised its baggage fees and warned it may cut up to 5% of its routes. FedEx, UPS, and even the U.S. Postal Service have added fuel surcharges. Markets did surge on the ceasefire news. Oil dropped as much as 16%, but it's still well above pre-war levels of around $70 per barrel of crude oil. And experts are urging caution. The Director General of the International Air Transport Association says it could take months for jet fuel supplies to normalize, and even if the strait does stay open, the economic damage from these 6 weeks of war will take a long time to unwind.
Well, definitely. But so we hear the news of the ceasefire definitely helped ease some of the concerns about this economic toll. But, this 2-week ceasefire, it's only lasting for just 2 weeks. In Washington, what kind of impact do you think this ceasefire could have on easing tensions and advancing negotiations?
Look, Washington is treating this as a window of opportunity, these upcoming negotiations in Islamabad, not as a finish line. Talks are confirmed to begin Saturday morning, and the U.S. is sending a serious delegation led by Vice President J.D. Vance, Special Envoy Steve Witkoff, and Jared Kushner, the president's son-in-law. It's a high-powered team, and it signals the administration genuinely wants a deal. There's also a China angle worth watching. The White House confirmed that high-level conversations with the U.S. and China took place during these ceasefire negotiations, and Trump's long-delayed trip to China is now back on the table. It's a sign of how broadly this conflict has reverberated around the world. That said, Vice President Vance has called this truce fragile, and that was within hours of it taking effect. Before departing for Islamabad, he tried to put the violations in perspective, saying ceasefires are always messy, and noting that missiles were launched within an hour of Trump's announcement, which prompted Israeli and Gulf Arab responses. Iran's parliament speaker accused the U.S. of violating 3 agreed points before the ink was even dry. The White House disagreed with that. And then there's Lebanon. Israel struck 100 Hezbollah targets in just 10 minutes on Wednesday, Lebanon's deadliest day since the war began. The human rights chief called the carnage defying belief, and Trump says Lebanon is not covered in the ceasefire. Pakistan's PM Sharif, who brokered the ceasefire deal between the U.S. and Iran, says it is. So there's some disagreement there. And on the military side, Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth made clear that U.S. forces aren't going anywhere, saying we'll stay put, stay ready, stay vigilant. The U.S. is keeping about 50,000 troops on the region on high alert.
So still definitely a lot of uncertainty in the air, and these 2 weeks could be a crucial window for diplomacy indeed. Now, when we look ahead to the upcoming talks, Chris, what does Washington ultimately want to achieve through its negotiations with Iran?
Yeah, the core objective for the U.S. has not changed: eliminate Iran's nuclear threat. The White House made that explicit, and Trump went further at a news conference on Wednesday, saying there will be no enrichment of uranium, and the United States will, working with Iran, dig up and remove all of the deeply buried nuclear dust. That's the strongest public language Trump has used on the nuclear question, and likely a preview of what Vance is going to start with at the table at negotiations on Saturday. But the challenge is that Iran's bottom line almost looks nothing like what the president said. Tehran's 10-point proposal calls for the U.S. to withdraw all combat forces from the region, lift every sanction on Iran, compensate Iran for war damages, and allow Iran to retain control of the Strait of Hormuz. There's one potentially interesting overlap in these upcoming talks. Iran's plan does include a commitment not to manufacture nuclear weapons, but it still insists at the same time on enriching uranium, the right to enrich uranium. So that's a fine point that's going to really need to be hammered out. Now, Washington also wants broader regional stability and an end to the threat from the Iranian-backed militant groups like Hezbollah, the Houthis, and Hamas, though that's a much longer conversation that won't be resolved this weekend. And, of course, the domestic clock is ticking on Donald Trump. Midterm elections are coming up in November. Markets have only partially covered, and gas is still high. So there's pressure on him to get a deal done that brings lasting economic relief to voters before they decide to whether to hold Republican politicians accountable for the high cost of living.
So still a lot of things in the air and differing opinions. Of course, we'll have to see how the discussion would be held. Thank you so much for your insights tonight, Chris.
Good to be with you.
Now, while Washington is assessing what the ceasefire could mean for diplomacy and the global energy markets, the reaction across the Middle East may look quite different. For a regional perspective, we are joined by Professor Mohammed El-Masri of the Doha Institute for Graduate Studies. Thank you for joining us, Professor.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
So, Professor, the U.S. and Iran, they may have agreed to a 2-week ceasefire like we've been talking about, but we've already seen deadly Israeli strikes in Lebanon. How is this development being viewed across the Middle East?
Well, look, people were obviously very relieved and happy when they first heard about the ceasefire, particularly given the escalatory language that President Trump had been using in the lead up to the agreement. But I also think that everyone in the region understands that Israel is a big spoiler in all of this. Israel has a long history of sabotaging peace agreements and ceasefires. And so it was expected that they would take actions that would basically try to flip the ceasefire on its head. Israel's not happy about the ceasefire. This was a war that was driven primarily by Israel, and so people in the region are relieved, but at the same time very concerned. And I think that after seeing what happened yesterday in Lebanon, people are even more concerned because it seems as though Israel is sort of lashing out and escalating in Lebanon, not just continuing the war on Lebanon, but actually escalating there. They reportedly killed at least 254 people yesterday in what is no doubt an implementation of what they call the Dahiya doctrine, which is an Israeli military doctrine named after a suburb of Beirut, Lebanon. And it calls for the punishment of civilian areas and civilian infrastructure. And so people are concerned, and obviously people are nervous because people in the region don't know what to expect from these negotiations. In Pakistan, as your previous guest noted, there are certainly significant differences between the American position and the Iranian position.
Right. So many were actually took by surprise of the latest attacks, definitely, especially since it comes following the ceasefire. But the Strait of Hormuz, let's talk about it. It has been at the center of this crisis. How has the disruption there been affecting Gulf economies and countries across the Middle East as well?
Well, the Strait of Hormuz is critical to Gulf economies. I'm sure that the viewers are aware that this is a major oil-producing region and also liquefied natural gas-producing region. And the Strait of Hormuz is an essential lifeline. About 20% of global oil shipments pass through the Strait of Hormuz. A significant percentage of natural gas shipments also pass through the Strait of Hormuz. So the economic consequences for the region have been dire. So certainly everyone here would like to see the strait reopened. The war, more generally, has been pretty catastrophic for the region. And I think what's interesting is that the war has also been catastrophic far beyond the region. So if you look at the Strait of Hormuz, for instance, and to your question, the president of the United States, Donald Trump, made a remark a few weeks ago suggesting that the Strait of Hormuz was not very important to the United States because the U.S. doesn't rely on the Strait of Hormuz. He's only partly accurate, though, because the reality is that oil is priced globally, and any increase in global oil prices affects Americans. And so we've seen 35% increases at the gas pump in the United States. So the effects here are not just felt in the region or in Asia or in Europe, but they're felt as far away as North America. And we shouldn't forget that when oil prices increase, there is a kind of ripple effect throughout the economy. The prices of goods, other goods and products also increases because transportation costs are increased on businesses, and those are passed on to consumers. So the economic consequences for the region and beyond are very significant. And I do think that the continued closure of the Strait of Hormuz was one of the main things that brought Donald Trump to the negotiating table.
A big leverage indeed. But Professor, considering, the ceasefire, many call it quite a temporary or fragile, regional powers like Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Qatar, they have been definitely watching this crisis very closely. What are their main concerns right now?
Well, I mean, I think the immediate priority is to try to make sure that this ceasefire sticks and that there isn't a return to war. I'm sure that players in the region will very much agree with Iran on some of these points in the Iranian 10-point proposal. In particular, there's obviously one of the 10 points that calls for a cessation of hostilities, but then there's another one that speaks to the future. And specifically, it talks about making sure that there isn't a return to war. And the Iranians there are asking for a binding UN Security Council resolution. My sense is that countries in the region will very much want that. Most of the countries in the region, although I think, I should express and emphasize that not all of the countries are the same. We can't put all of the GCC countries in the same category, right? So they're concerned about the war and the instability and the economy, and obviously their energy sites have been hit. It's been catastrophic, as I mentioned in a response to your previous question. But the countries in the region are also very concerned about Israel in particular, beyond this latest conflagration. Israel has been pursuing their so-called Greater Israel Project pretty aggressively over the past couple of years. They're seeking to expand their borders, and as such, they're trying to establish themselves as the only hegemons in the region. And they've been sort of on a rampage through not only Gaza and the West Bank, but also Lebanon, and then into Iran and even Syria, where they are working on a project that they're calling David's Corridor, which is on the southern border of Syria in an attempt to carve out land there that would connect the Euphrates area in Iraq with Israel. The Greater Israel Project, in that belief, in that deeply held Zionist belief, Greater Israel stretches from the Nile River in Egypt all the way to the Euphrates River in Iraq. And the Israeli government has been speaking openly about this project as a desired outcome, and countries in the region are very concerned about it.
Right, so Israel is another big factor that weighs in. But before we conclude our discussion tonight, Professor, from Iran's perspective, what does Tehran ultimately hope to achieve through these negotiations?
Well, there are a number of things. I think the two most important are, number one, a complete end to not only the war on Iran, which Iran views very much as a war of aggression, an illegal war of aggression, but also the war on Lebanon and all their hostilities in the region. That's number one. But number two, they want to make sure, as I said, that there isn't a return to hostilities, and that's where this UN Security Council resolution would come in. And then there are a number of other things that the Iranians want. It remains to be seen whether they'll get them, but they would like reparations for all of the damages that have been caused to their country. My sense is that the United States is not going to provide reparations to Iran. I don't think that the U.S. is in a financial position to do that, and I think that would be extremely politically costly for the President of the United States to agree to anything like that. But that's where I think the Iranians might insist on a tolling system at the Strait of Hormuz to try to recover some of the money that they've lost, to try to help their economy recover. So I think these are going to be some of the priorities in addition to sanctions relief and the right to enrich uranium in line with international norms for civilian use.
Right, so we'll have to see if the ceasefire could open the door for more meaningful discussions ahead. Thank you so much for sharing us your insights, Professor El-Masri.
Thank you for having me.
And that'll be all from us on Within the Frame tonight. Be sure to tune in again next time as we continue to explore the stories that matter. Till then, stay informed and engaged.